she flashed her FBI badge. And everything changed. Imagine this, you're exhausted, barely holding on after weeks of grueling work, just trying to get home. You finally settle into your seat on a late-night flight, hoping for a few hours of peace. But within minutes, someone is demanding you move, because they don't believe you belong there. This was Special Agent Naomi Carter's reality. But what started as an infuriating confrontation at 30,000 feet was about to unravel into a night of shocking betrayals, deadly secrets, and a fight for survival. Because when Naomi refused to back down, she wasn't just defending her seat, she was stepping into the center of a conspiracy years in the making. A poisoned whistleblower, a kidnapped businessman, and a criminal empire that thrived in the shadows. Before the night was over, lives would be lost, alliances would be tested, and the truth would come at a deadly price. But Naomi had one advantage they didn't see coming. And when she flashed her FBI badge, everything changed. Will she uncover the truth before it's too late? Or has she just made herself the syndicate's next target? Hit like if you love a good thriller, comment your theories below, and subscribe, because trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. Naomi Carter sighed as she stepped onto the plane, her tired eyes scanning the rows of plush first-class seats. She had spent the last 6 months buried in the kind of work that drained a person down to their bones, long nights, endless reports, and the constant weight of cases that never seemed to truly close. Today, though, she allowed herself a rare luxury. She had splurged on a first-class ticket, telling herself she had earned it. After all, when was the last time she had done something just for herself? She adjusted the strap of her worn leather carry-on and made her way down the aisle. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and expensive cologne. A few passengers had already settled in, tapping on tablets or flipping through magazines, wrapped in the quiet bubble that first class provided. Finding seat 3A, she eased into the wide, cushioned chair with a sigh of relief. The seat was roomy, a stark contrast to the cramped spaces she was used to. She leaned back, letting the softness cradle her aching muscles. For the first time in months, she had no case files to review, no reports to submit, no surveillance footage to watch. Just 6 hours of uninterrupted peace. Or so she thought. As the flight attendant, a young woman with a warm smile, stopped by to offer her a pre-flight drink, Naomi shook her head. "Just water, please," she said, forcing a small smile. She wasn't here for indulgence, just rest. She exhaled deeply, her fingers grazing the small gold ring she wore on a chain around her neck, a reminder of her grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to fight, how to endure, how to survive. Tonight, she just wanted to breathe. Naomi had just settled into her seat, her body relaxing for the first time in weeks, when she heard a voice, sharp, impatient, cut through the hushed murmur of first-class conversation. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone clipped and full of irritation. "I believe you're in my seat." Naomi looked up, blinking away the exhaustion clouding her thoughts. The man standing before her was in his mid-50s, well-dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his tanned skin smooth in a way that suggested he had lived a life of privilege, one free of sleepless nights spent chasing criminals or poring over case files. He held a leather briefcase in one hand, his other resting on his hip in barely contained frustration. Naomi glanced down at her boarding pass, double-checking the number. Seat 3A. She looked back up at him, her voice calm but firm. "This is my seat," she said, holding up her ticket for him to see. The man's mouth pressed into a thin line. He didn't look at her ticket. Instead, he let his eyes sweep over her, taking in her simple black sweater, her well-worn jeans, her natural curls pulled back into a ponytail. His gaze lingered on her for a second too long, like he was trying to place her. Or, more likely, figure out why someone who looked like her was sitting where he expected to be. "There must be some mistake," he said finally. "I fly this route every week, and I always book seat 3A. Naomi felt a flicker of irritation but kept her expression neutral. "It looks like you have 3B, the seat right next to me." The man, Gregory Langston, she would later learn, let out a small, forced chuckle, shaking his head. No, that's not right. I always get the window seat. Naomi didn't move. She didn't shift, didn't offer to trade, didn't give in to the unspoken expectation that she should just step aside and let him have what he wanted. I'm sorry, but this is my seat, she repeated. Gregory's face darkened, the polite mask slipping just a bit. He turned abruptly and flagged down a passing flight attendant. Excuse me, he said, his voice louder now, demanding attention. There seems to be a seating error. He gestured toward Naomi but didn't look at her. This woman is in my seat. Naomi sighed. She had seen this before. Men like him didn't like being told no, especially not by women like her. The flight attendant, a young woman with an apologetic smile, took both of their boarding passes and scanned them. She barely glanced at Naomi's before turning to Gregory. Sir, it looks like you have seat 3B, the aisle seat. 3A is assigned to this passenger. Gregory's face reddened. That's impossible. I specifically requested a window seat. I always sit there. The flight attendant offered another carefully polite smile. I understand, sir, but according to our system, this is the correct assignment. She glanced at her tablet. We are fully booked tonight, but I can check if there are any other window seats available in premium economy. Gregory stiffened, the very suggestion seeming to offend him. Absolutely not. I paid for first class, and that's what I expect to receive. Naomi watched the scene unfold, feeling a familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of knowing that if she showed even a fraction of his frustration, the situation could turn against her in an instant. She could already feel other passengers watching, some with mild curiosity, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to notice. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice steady. Is there a problem with me sitting here? Gregory scoffed. I didn't say that. But he didn't have to. The implication was loud and clear. For a brief moment, Naomi considered switching seats just to make the situation go away, to avoid the stares, the tension, the exhaustion of dealing with yet another entitled man who thought the world bent to his wishes. But she was done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. Instead, she leaned back in her seat and gave the flight attendant an easy smile. It sounds like we're all set here, then. Gregory's jaw clenched, but he had no choice but to lower himself into 3B, huffing as he stowed his briefcase under the seat. As the flight attendant moved on, Naomi caught a glimpse of Gregory pulling a small bottle of hand sanitizer from his pocket. He squeezed a generous amount into his palm and scrubbed at the armrest between them like he had just sat next to something unclean. Naomi didn't react. She had seen it all before. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her book, and ignored him. She had no way of knowing that this small confrontation, this seemingly routine moment of arrogance and entitlement, was just the beginning. Naomi had just opened her book, willing herself to tune out Gregory Langston's barely contained irritation beside her, when a sharp voice from a few rows behind made her pause. I am not sitting there, the voice insisted, edged with the unmistakable tone of someone used to getting their way. Naomi turned her head slightly, as did several other passengers, to see an older woman, Margaret Collins, her name tag still pinned to her expensive knit cardigan, standing in the aisle, lips pursed in disgust. Her manicured fingers gripped the handle of her designer carry-on, and she looked positively scandalized as she pointed at the open seat beside a young man in the window seat. The young man, Omar Rami, looked up, confusion flickering across his features. He had just finished tucking his bag beneath the seat and was in the middle of buckling his seatbelt when he realized all eyes were now on him. Ma'am, this is your assigned seat, the flight attendant, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, explained gently, showing her the seating chart on his tablet. Margaret shook her head firmly. No. I can't sit there. Marcus blinked. Is there a specific issue with the seat? Margaret hesitated, but her gaze flickered toward Omar, and the answer became clear. You don't understand, she said, lowering her voice as if she were about to share a dark secret. His kind, she stopped, glancing around at the nearby passengers, then pressed her lips together. I just don't feel comfortable. Surely there's another seat available. A hush fell over the immediate area. The discomfort was palpable, passengers exchanging awkward glances, some pretending not to hear while others looked on with disapproval. Omar inhaled sharply, his hands gripping the armrests as color rose in his cheeks. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice calm but firm. I was born in Michigan, he said quietly. I'm a second-year medical student at Johns Hopkins. Margaret let out a tight, humorless laugh. Well, good for you, dear, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. That doesn't change how I feel. Naomi's stomach twisted. She had seen this kind of prejudice before, the way it wrapped itself in polite words and thinly veiled excuses, all while pretending it wasn't what it clearly was. Margaret turned back to Marcus, pressing the issue. I'm a nervous flyer, she said, her voice suddenly frail. I can't be in an uncomfortable situation for the entire flight. Please, just move me somewhere else. Naomi had heard enough. Before Marcus could respond, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. I'll switch, she called out. Margaret turned, surprised, as Naomi made her way down the aisle. Omar's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude there, though she could also see the weariness, the exhaustion of having to defend himself against baseless assumptions. Gregory, still seated in 3B, scoffed under his breath as Naomi grabbed her carry-on from the overhead compartment. You just can't help yourself, can you? He muttered. Naomi ignored him. She reached Marcus and gestured toward Omar's seat. I was in 3A, she told him. If it makes things easier, I'll take this one instead. Omar looked at her, uncertain. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. It's no trouble, Naomi assured him. Then, her voice took on a slight edge. And besides, I wouldn't want anyone to be uncomfortable on this flight. Margaret's eyes narrowed, sensing the challenge, but she didn't say another word. Marcus, looking immensely relieved to resolve the conflict, nodded quickly. All right, then. Miss Collins, please take 3A in first class. Margaret's face lit up at the mention of first class, as though the entire disagreement had been worth it if it meant a better seat. She gave Naomi a stiff nod, acknowledgement, not gratitude, before gathering her things and heading toward the front of the plane. As Naomi settled into her new seat beside Omar, he exhaled, shaking his head with a tired smile. Thank you, he murmured. Naomi glanced at him, then back toward where Margaret had disappeared into first class. Don't thank me, she said. I just did what she should have done in the first place. Omar nodded, his fingers lightly tapping the seatbelt buckle. He was composed, but Naomi knew situations like this weren't new to him. You'd think people would know better by now, he said softly. Naomi sighed, leaning back. Some people never change. But that doesn't mean we stop pushing back. The plane continued boarding, the moment fading as conversations resumed and flight attendants bustled through the aisles. But Naomi knew, some moments stayed with you long after the flight had landed. Naomi didn't hesitate. The moment she saw Omar's shoulders tense under the weight of Margaret Collins' words, she knew exactly what was happening. She had seen this before. The polite tone masking prejudice, the way people like Margaret dressed up their discomfort as of personal preference, as if their biases were as natural as preferring the window seat over the aisle. But the worst part? The silence. People heard. They always did. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others pretended not to notice, eyes darting away as if ignoring it made it go away. Naomi knew better. Excuse me, she said, her voice carrying through the tense space between them. I'll switch. Margaret's head snapped toward her, startled. Omar turned, eyes wide. You don't have to do that, he murmured, clearly not wanting to cause trouble. Naomi met his gaze and saw a familiar exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from having to defend yourself over and over again. Having to prove you belonged. It's no trouble, she said, her voice steady. The flight attendant, Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure, ma'am?" "I'm sure." Naomi turned toward Margaret, giving her a polite but pointed smile. "This way, you won't have to be uncomfortable." Margaret's lips thinned. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but then seemed to realize she had won. She was getting exactly what she wanted. Her expression softened, taking on a smug satisfaction as she gathered her things. "Well," she sniffed, "if you insist." Naomi bit back the urge to say something sharper. Instead, she turned to Marcus. "I was in 3A. Miss Collins can take that seat." Marcus, clearly relieved to defuse the situation, nodded. "All right, I'll update the seating chart." As Margaret made her way toward first class, Naomi grabbed her carry-on and stepped into the aisle. She glanced at Omar. "You okay?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Thank you." Naomi took the now vacant seat beside him, buckling in as the rest of the passengers finished settling. The hum of conversation returned, but the air still held the weight of what had just happened. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Naomi let Omar have the space to process it. She knew how it felt to be singled out like that. Then, finally, he let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I wasn't expecting that." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Expecting what?" "For someone to step in." She exhaled slowly. "You get used to people looking the other way." Omar gave her a knowing look. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You do." Naomi studied him for a moment. Young, smart, composed, but carrying something heavy, something he'd likely been carrying for years. "What's your specialty?" she asked, shifting the conversation. "Cardiology," he said. "Well, eventually. Right now, I'm just a second-year med student trying to survive rotations." Naomi smiled. "Big dreams?" Omar shrugged. "More like big expectations." He tapped his fingers against the armrest. "My parents came here with nothing. Everything I do is, for them, you know?" She did. All too well. "Well," she said, glancing at him, "if I ever have a heart attack on this flight, I guess I'm in good hands." Omar laughed, a genuine, light sound that finally cracked the tension in the air. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he said. Naomi smirked. "No promises." As the last few passengers boarded, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming them on the 5-hour flight to Atlanta. Naomi leaned back in her seat, exhaling. The confrontation with Margaret was over, but something told her that the real turbulence was yet to come. The hum of the plane had finally settled into a gentle rhythm. Most of the passengers were adjusting to the reality of a long overnight flight, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others closing their eyes in hopes of getting some rest before landing in Atlanta. Naomi had just begun to relax in her seat when a sudden, sharp gasp cut through the cabin. She turned her head toward the sound and saw an elderly man clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. He was seated a few rows ahead, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. His seatmate, a woman in her 60s with short silver hair, had her hand on his arm, her face full of panic. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice rising with alarm. The man, Henry Wallace, according to the name tag pinned to his jacket, didn't respond. His fingers clenched around his armrest, his entire body tense. Then, just as suddenly, he slumped forward, his head dropping toward his chest. A flight attendant rushed over, eyes wide with concern. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Naomi was already on her feet, moving toward them. "I'm a federal agent," she said quickly, flashing her badge. "I've had emergency response training." "What happened?" "He was fine a moment ago," the woman beside him stammered. "We were just talking about his granddaughter's wedding, and then he grabbed his chest, like he was in pain." Naomi's instincts went on high alert. A heart attack? Or something else? Just then, another voice spoke up. "I'm a medical student." It was Omar Rami. He had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was moving toward Henry's seat, his face focused, his hand steady. Naomi stepped aside, letting him through. Omar knelt beside Henry, 2 fingers pressing against the older man's neck. After a moment, he shook his head. His pulse is weak. We need to get him on the floor. The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded. Let me get the emergency medical kit. As she hurried away, Omar looked at Naomi. Help me lift him. Together, they eased Henry out of his seat and onto the narrow aisle floor, careful not to jostle him too much. Naomi's heart pounded, not from fear, but from something nagging at her instincts. Something about this didn't feel right. Omar leaned in closer, checking Henry's pupils. His breathing is shallow, he muttered, almost to himself. This could be a heart attack, but something's off. Naomi caught the flicker of doubt in Omar's expression. You're thinking it could be something else? Omar hesitated before answering. Maybe. He stopped and shook his head. I need the medical kit. The flight attendant returned, kneeling beside them as she opened the kit. Omar grabbed a blood pressure cuff and quickly assessed Henry's vitals. His frown deepened. This doesn't make sense, he murmured. His heart rate is all over the place, but his skin tone. Naomi didn't need a medical degree to notice what he meant. Henry's face was pale, but not flushed. And his breathing, though labored, wasn't the usual gasping struggle of someone suffering from a severe heart attack. Has he taken anything? Omar asked the woman who had been sitting beside him. She shook her head frantically. Not that I saw. He was drinking water. He said he felt fine. Naomi's gut twisted. Something wasn't adding up. Sir, can you hear me? Omar said loudly, gently tapping Henry's cheek. A long moment passed, and then a weak groan. Henry's eyelids fluttered open just slightly, his lips barely moving. Naomi leaned in, her pulse quickening. Mr. Wallace, can you tell us what's wrong? His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then, finally, a whisper. They were poisoned. The words barely escaped before Henry's eyes rolled back, and his body went completely limp. Omar's head snapped toward Naomi, his expression sharp with alarm. This isn't just a heart attack, he said in a hushed voice. This might be something else entirely. Naomi's stomach dropped. Poisoned? She glanced around the cabin, her eyes scanning the first-class section. Who would want to harm Henry Wallace? And why? Her gaze landed on a familiar face, Gregory Langston, watching from his seat, his expression unreadable. And just like that, Naomi knew. Something much bigger was at play. The plane cabin had gone eerily quiet. The usual hum of quiet conversations and the occasional ding of the service call button had faded as more passengers realized that something was wrong. Naomi knelt beside Henry Wallace, feeling the tension in the air thickening. His breathing was shallow, his skin unusually pale, and his pulse felt weak and erratic beneath Omar's fingertips. Omar's expression remained focused, but Naomi could see the concern in his eyes. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, but there was a confidence in his movements, a quiet certainty that told Naomi this wasn't his first time dealing with a medical emergency. We need to keep him stable until we land, Omar said, voice calm but firm. He turned to the flight attendant. Do you have an oxygen tank in the medical kit? Marcus, the attendant, nodded quickly. Yes, I'll get it now. He disappeared toward the front of the plane. Omar reached for the emergency medical kit they had been given earlier. His hands were steady as he pulled out a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. He's barely responsive, but his heart is still beating, Omar murmured as he worked. His pulse is irregular. It could be a heart attack, but his symptoms, he shook his head. Something's off. Naomi was already thinking the same thing. Henry had whispered something before losing consciousness. They poisoned. Could that have been the rambling of a man in distress, or was there something more to it? As Omar wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Henry's frail arm, he glanced at Naomi. "Can you hold him steady?" She nodded, placing a firm but careful hand on Henry's shoulder to keep him from shifting. Omar squeezed the bulb of the cuff, watching the gauge as he listened with the stethoscope. After a few seconds, his frown deepened. "His blood pressure is dangerously low," Omar muttered under his breath. "That doesn't usually happen this fast with a standard heart attack. He needs medical attention as soon as we land." "Can he make it until then?" Naomi asked, her voice quieter now. Omar hesitated. "I think so, but we need to be careful." At that moment, Marcus returned with the oxygen tank and mask, kneeling beside them. Omar took it without hesitation and placed the mask over Henry's nose and mouth. "This should help," Omar said, adjusting the flow of oxygen. "We just need to keep him stable." The woman who had been sitting beside Henry looked on, her face lined with worry. I just don't understand," she stammered. "He was fine before. He said he was excited about his granddaughter's wedding. Then, all of a sudden..." Naomi glanced at Omar. He didn't say anything, but she could see that he had the same concern she did. This was too sudden. Too suspicious. "We'll do everything we can," Omar assured the woman gently. "Do you know if he takes any medication? Anything for his heart?" The woman shook her head quickly. "No, not that I know of. He mentioned he had some minor health issues, but nothing serious." Omar's brows furrowed. He turned back to Naomi, lowering his voice. "This doesn't look like a typical heart attack," he admitted. "If he was poisoned, even by accident, we need to figure out what he was exposed to." Naomi's instincts were already in overdrive. Something wasn't right. Her eyes swept the first-class cabin. Most passengers were watching with concern, but one stood out. Gregory Langston. He sat stiffly in his seat, watching them, or rather, watching Henry. His fingers tapped against his knee, his jaw tight. Naomi knew that look. It was the look of someone trying to decide what to do next. Her stomach tightened. They weren't just dealing with a medical emergency. They were dealing with something much bigger. As Omar adjusted the oxygen mask on Henry's face, Naomi took a step back, scanning the first-class cabin with sharpened instincts. Something felt off. Henry's collapse had been sudden, and his murmured words, "they poisoned," clung to her thoughts like an unsolved puzzle. Her gaze drifted across the seated passengers, noting their expressions. Most wore concerned but passive looks, the kind of faces people made when they were witnessing a crisis but didn't want to get involved. But then she saw Gregory Langston. He was too still. Too controlled. He sat stiffly in his aisle seat, his gaze locked straight ahead, his jaw tight. But what struck Naomi wasn't just his body language, it was the way he had reacted earlier. In the moment Henry had collapsed, Gregory had tensed, not with concern, but with recognition. Naomi replayed the moment in her mind. That sharp inhale. That flicker of something in his eyes, alarm, maybe? Shock? It was barely perceptible, but Naomi had spent years reading people, knowing when their emotions betrayed them. Henry Wallace had collapsed, and Gregory Langston had recognized him. More than that, he had deliberately avoided looking at him since. Naomi's instincts went on high alert. She watched as Gregory carefully reached for his glass of water on the tray table, taking a slow sip, his fingers too steady for a man who had just witnessed someone have a medical emergency a few feet away. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't curious. He was waiting. A flight attendant passed by, asking if anyone needed anything. Gregory shook his head, forcing a polite smile, but Naomi saw it. The tension in his jaw. The way his fingers tapped against his knee, a small but restless movement, as if his body was betraying the calm expression he was trying to maintain. Then she caught something else. Henry was awake. His eyes barely open, his breathing still shallow beneath the oxygen mask, but there was a moment, just a flicker, where his gaze landed on Gregory. And Gregory saw him. It was an instant of unspoken recognition, and Naomi saw everything she needed to see in that brief exchange. Gregory knew Henry. Henry knew Gregory. But neither of them acknowledged it. Instead, Gregory's grip on his glass tightened slightly, and he looked away, staring firmly at the seat back in front of him, as if the older man did not exist. Naomi's pulse quickened. She had been in enough investigations to know what this meant. This wasn't two strangers on the same flight. This was two men with a history, one they didn't want anyone else to notice. She knelt back down beside Henry, keeping her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "do you know where you are?" Henry blinked sluggishly, then gave a barely perceptible nod. "Do you know what happened to you?" His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Naomi didn't push him. He was weak, too weak. If he had been poisoned, he was fighting more than just exhaustion. Instead, she leaned in slightly and dropped her voice even lower. "Do you know anyone on this flight?" Henry's eyelids fluttered, his chest rising in a shaky breath. For a moment, Naomi thought he might respond. Then, barely moving, his gaze flickered toward Gregory. Naomi followed his line of sight. Gregory was still looking away, deliberately avoiding Henry like a man trying to pretend a ghost from his past hadn't just collapsed right in front of him. Naomi felt the weight of the moment settle in her gut. Something was going on here. She glanced at Omar, who was still monitoring Henry's vitals. He didn't say anything, but the tightness in his expression told her that he, too, had noticed something wasn't right. Standing up, Naomi took a slow breath and turned her full attention to Gregory. She wasn't going to let this go. Not when every instinct she had was telling her that this was only the beginning. Naomi knew something wasn't right. Henry Wallace had recognized Gregory Langston, and Gregory had done everything in his power to pretend otherwise. That alone would have been enough to keep her on edge. But the way Gregory kept stealing glances toward Henry, subtle, cautious, told her he was worried about something. And Naomi needed to find out what. As the flight crew worked to keep Henry stable, Gregory Langston unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he was trying not to draw attention to himself. But Naomi saw it. She watched as he grabbed his phone from his pocket and stepped toward the front of the cabin, speaking quietly to a flight attendant. "I need to make a private call," he said, his voice smooth but urgent. "It's an important business matter." The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, we ask that all passengers remain seated while we tend to the medical emergency." Gregory sighed, putting on the charm that men like him relied on, entitlement disguised as politeness. "Of course, I understand. I just need a moment. My company depends on me handling these things promptly." The flight attendant nodded, gesturing toward the galley near the front of the plane. Naomi saw the flicker of relief on Gregory's face as he disappeared behind the curtain. She didn't hesitate. She followed. Moving quietly, she stopped just short of the galley, staying just out of sight. Gregory's voice was low but tense. "Yeah, I know. I'm handling it." A pause. "No, listen, there's a complication." Naomi's heartbeat quickened. A complication. Was he talking about Henry? About what just happened? Gregory exhaled sharply. "I don't know how bad it is yet. But listen, we need to keep the shipment on schedule. No delays." Naomi's stomach twisted. "Shipment?" Gregory lowered his voice even more, forcing Naomi to lean in slightly to catch his words. "The Atlanta warehouse is already prepped," he said. No changes. We keep things moving like we planned. Understand?" A long pause. Then, Gregory's voice dropped to a near whisper. "If he talks, it's over." Naomi didn't move. "If who talks?" Henry? Was this about him? Had she just stumbled into something far bigger than a business deal? Gregory made a sharp noise of frustration. "I said I'm handling it. Just keep everything moving. I'll check in once we land." With that, he ended the call. Naomi exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Gregory Langston wasn't just an arrogant businessman. He was hiding something. And Naomi was going to find out exactly what. The plane touched down in Atlanta, the wheels hitting the runway with a firm jolt. A few passengers stirred awake, stretching stiff limbs, while others instinctively reached for their phones. For most, the flight was over. But Naomi knew the real trouble was just beginning. Her eyes remained on Gregory Langston, who sat unnaturally still in his seat. He had barely moved since making his hushed phone call in the galley. The tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders, it was clear he was waiting for something. Naomi wasn't sure what. But she was going to find out. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began shifting, unbuckling, and reaching for overhead bags. Gregory, however, didn't make a move, not right away. Instead, he checked his watch, his fingers tapping lightly against the tray table. Then, he stood up. Naomi followed his movements closely, watching as he grabbed his sleek black carry-on and stepped into the aisle. His eyes darted once toward Henry Wallace, still semi-conscious under Omar's watchful care, but he didn't linger. Instead, he walked with purpose toward the front of the plane. Naomi had a choice. Stay with Henry or follow Gregory. Instinct told her the danger was following Gregory. She grabbed her bag and moved behind him, weaving through passengers as they shuffled forward. By the time she stepped into the jetway, Gregory was already ahead, his gait quick and determined. Then she saw them. Two men stood just outside the gate, both wearing TSA uniforms. At a glance, they blended in, looking every bit like airport security. But something wasn't right. They weren't scanning the crowd like normal TSA agents. They were focused solely on Gregory. And Gregory, who had spent the entire flight looking anxious, impatient, and restless, now had an almost relieved expression. Naomi slowed her pace, pressing herself slightly against the wall as she watched the interaction unfold. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with graying hair, stepped forward. "Mr. Langston?" His voice was polite but firm. Gregory nodded, barely hesitating. "That's me." The second man, leaner, with sharp eyes, flashed a badge. "TSA. We need you to come with us for additional screening." Naomi frowned. Something was off. Gregory, a man who had made a very important phone call mid-flight, didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded. Naomi's pulse quickened. This wasn't routine. This was planned. Gregory adjusted his carry-on and followed the men without a single protest. No one else noticed. The other passengers were too preoccupied with gathering bags, checking phones, or stretching sore limbs. To the casual observer, it was just another businessman being pulled aside for a random security check. But Naomi knew better. Her FBI training kicked in. This was an extraction. She reached for her phone, snapped a quick photo of the two men, and started moving toward them. She wasn't sure what she was going to say yet. But if these men were legitimate, there would be paperwork. There would be questions. There would be standard procedures. Before she could take more than a few steps, however, Gregory was gone. The two men led him down a restricted hallway marked authorized personnel only, and the door clicked shut behind them. Naomi sped up, pushing past a slow-moving group of passengers. By the time she reached the door, she tested the handle, locked. She cursed under her breath. There was no way those were actual TSA agents. No way this was protocol. Gregory Langston hadn't just been detained. He had been taken. And Naomi had a sinking feeling she was running out of time to figure out why. The chaos of deplaning had settled, but the tension in Naomi's chest hadn't. Gregory Langston was gone, vanished behind a locked door with two men posing as TSA agents. And now, Naomi had an even bigger problem. Henry Wallace was fading fast. Omar was still at Henry's side, monitoring his breathing as a real TSA officer and an airport paramedic knelt beside them. The paramedics had arrived within minutes of landing, but Naomi could see the worry in their faces. Henry was barely conscious, his body weak, his skin pale. He needed to get to a hospital. Fast. Naomi crouched beside Henry, her voice steady but urgent. "Mr. Wallace, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, but he didn't answer. She leaned in closer. "Henry, listen to me. I need to know what happened. You whispered something earlier. You said," she hesitated, lowering her voice. "You said you were poisoned." A slight tremor ran through Henry's body, as if her words had pulled him back from the edge of unconsciousness. He heard her. He understood. Naomi exchanged a quick look with Omar. He nodded slightly, silently confirming what she already suspected: Henry Wallace had been targeted. Henry took a slow, rattling breath. His lips parted, and Naomi leaned in, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Langston," Henry rasped. His voice was so weak she almost didn't catch it. Naomi stiffened. "Gregory Langston? What about him?" Henry's fingers twitched slightly, as if trying to grasp something unseen. He struggled to speak, his throat dry, his breath shallow. "He's not who he says," Henry whispered. His words were labored, but the urgency in them was unmistakable. "He's part of something big." Naomi felt a chill creep down her spine. "Part of what?" she pressed. "Henry, you have to tell me." Henry's body shuddered slightly, and for a terrifying moment, Naomi thought she had lost him. But then, his eyes flickered open again, just barely. "Shipment," he rasped. "Atlanta, warehouse, midnight." Naomi inhaled sharply. "The shipment. The same one Gregory mentioned in his phone call." "What's in the shipment?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's lips parted again, but no sound came out. His breathing grew ragged, his body trembling. The paramedic placed a firm hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Ma'am, we need to move him now." Naomi clenched her jaw. She was running out of time. She turned back to Henry. "Henry, look at me." His gaze was unfocused, but he was still holding on. "Whatever is in that shipment, is it dangerous?" A weak nod. Naomi's stomach twisted. "Is it people?" She needed to ask. She needed to be sure. Henry didn't answer right away. His lips barely moved as he exhaled one final word. "Run." The paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, securing the oxygen mask over his face. Naomi stood as they wheeled him away, her mind racing. Gregory Langston had been taken. Henry Wallace had been poisoned. And somewhere in Atlanta, at midnight, a shipment was waiting. Whatever was coming next, Naomi knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running. She was going to stop it. Naomi sat in a quiet corner of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, her phone in hand, her mind racing. Around her, the world carried on as if nothing had happened, families reunited, flight attendants bustled by, and the overhead speakers calmly announced the next round of departures. But for Naomi, the flight had changed everything. Henry Wallace had been wheeled off to the hospital, barely holding on. His warning still echoed in her mind. Gregory Langston isn't who he says he is. Gregory was gone now, taken by two men disguised as TSA agents. Naomi had seen extractions before, and this had all the hallmarks of a professional operation. Someone had wanted him out of the airport quietly, without attracting attention. She needed to know why. She tapped her screen and accessed a secure FBI database. Gregory Langston's name, date of birth, and seat assignment from the flight manifest were enough to start her search. Within seconds, the results loaded. Gregory Langston, age 56. CEO of Langston Medical Solutions, a company specializing in high-end medical equipment distribution. A frequent traveler, he took regular flights between New York, Atlanta, and Miami. Nothing stood out at first glance. But Naomi had spent years chasing criminals who hid in plain sight, and she knew where to look. She scrolled further, past the standard biography and professional credentials. Langston Medical Solutions was privately owned, an unusual choice for a company making multi-million-dollar deals with hospitals and government agencies. No shareholders. No public financial records. And then, there it was, 3 years ago, Langston Medical Solutions had been flagged in a financial investigation by Homeland Security. The case had been closed without explanation. Naomi's gut twisted. Cases didn't just close like that. Someone had buried it. She scrolled further, searching for the lead investigator's name. When she found it, her breath caught. Special Agent Henry Wallace. It was no coincidence. Henry had retired from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division 5 years ago. That meant his investigation into Langston's company had started at least 2 years before that. He must have found something that had led to the case being shut down from above. And now, years later, he had recognized Gregory on the flight. That recognition had almost certainly gotten him poisoned. A chill ran through Naomi. Henry had been silenced once before, and now, someone had tried to make sure he stayed silent for good. She needed more. She checked Gregory's travel history, looking for patterns. He flew to Atlanta twice a month, never staying longer than 2 days. His company had no listed offices or warehouses in the city. Yet, Henry's last words had been about a shipment. A shipment in Atlanta, at midnight. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she cross-referenced Langston Medical Solutions with shipping companies, freight distributors, and warehouse properties. One match popped up. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Owned by a shell company. Leased under an alias. That wasn't just a business transaction. That was something Gregory had deliberately hidden. She sat back, her pulse steady but sharp with adrenaline. If Henry had been investigating Gregory's company years ago, what had he found? And why had someone tried to kill him for it? She didn't hesitate. She opened a secure FBI messaging app and sent an urgent coded message to the Atlanta field office. Possible trafficking or smuggling operation. Need immediate surveillance on warehouse at listed location. Midnight shipment may be connected. She hesitated before adding another line. Potential bureau corruption involved. Exercise caution. That last part made her stomach twist. If the case had been shut down years ago, that meant someone inside the agency had wanted it buried. If that same person caught wind of what she was doing, she might be next on their list. Naomi rubbed her temples, exhaustion pressing down on her. She had expected a quiet flight, a moment of peace after months of grueling work. Instead, she had walked straight into something far bigger than she had anticipated. This wasn't about medical equipment. It was about human lives. She exhaled and looked at the clock. Midnight was only a few hours away. She had work to do. Naomi sat in the dimly lit airport lounge, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off her tired eyes. She had moved to a quiet corner, away from the flow of passengers, her fingers tapping steadily against the keyboard. Every instinct told her that Henry Wallace's warning and Gregory Langston's disappearance were just the tip of something much larger. Now, as she dug deeper, those instincts were proving right. The name Langston Medical Solutions was still open in her search results, but Naomi wasn't just looking at the company anymore. She was searching for connections, people, places, and transactions that might reveal the hidden web Gregory Langston was entangled in. She traced the Atlanta warehouse she had found earlier, cross-referencing it with known criminal organizations. The warehouse itself had been leased under an alias, making it difficult to link directly to Langston Medical Solutions. But Naomi had worked too many cases like this to be discouraged. Instead, she started looking at the companies that had leased the property before. That was when she found something interesting. Over the past 10 years, the warehouse had changed ownership 6 times. Each time, the new company had existed on paper for only a few years before dissolving, each one just a different name, a different shell, a different front. But the same three people had been listed as executives in at least two of these companies. Naomi's pulse quickened as she ran their names through the FBI database. Two of them came up clean, at least on the surface. But the third name sent a cold jolt through her spine. William Cahill. The name wasn't widely known outside of law enforcement circles, but to those who investigated organized crime, it was synonymous with corruption, smuggling, and human trafficking. Cahill was suspected of being one of the key players behind the Southern Syndicate, a secretive network controlling illegal arms trade, drug distribution, and human trafficking across the southeastern United States. For years, law enforcement agencies had tried to take the group down, but the syndicate was smart. They operated through intermediaries, using legitimate businesses as a cover. Every time a case got too close, evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant their statements, and investigations would stall. The Southern Syndicate didn't just control the streets. They had influence in government, in law enforcement, even in the courts. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. Gregory Langston was connected to Cahill. His company, Langston Medical Solutions, might have been a front for something much worse than just financial fraud. She switched her search to Langston Medical Solutions financial records, looking for signs of illegal money transfers or connections to offshore accounts. What she found made her stomach tighten. Payments from hospitals, government contracts, medical suppliers, all standard transactions, nothing out of the ordinary. But tucked between them were payments from companies that didn't seem to exist. Companies with vague names, no business websites, and addresses that traced back to empty lots or virtual offices. One of these phantom companies had made a six-figure payment to Langston Medical Solutions just 2 weeks ago. The listed reason? Expedited pharmaceutical distribution. Naomi had seen enough cover-ups in her career to know this was money laundering. These weren't payments for actual medical equipment. This was a criminal enterprise using a legitimate business as a pipeline for illegal shipments. Her stomach turned as she thought back to Henry Wallace's last words. Shipment. Atlanta warehouse. Midnight. Gregory's company was laundering money. The warehouse was in use. Henry had tried to expose it. And someone had poisoned him to keep him quiet. Naomi took a slow breath, staring at the screen. This wasn't just about Gregory Langston. This was about an entire criminal empire. The Southern Syndicate had been operating in the shadows for years, avoiding detection, silencing anyone who got too close. And now, she had stepped right into the middle of it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She knew what she had to do next. She sent another message to the Atlanta FBI field office. Confirmed connection between Langston Medical Solutions and the Southern Syndicate. High likelihood of human trafficking operation. Need immediate response at the Atlanta warehouse. Midnight shipment may be critical. She hesitated for only a second before adding one final line. Suspect Langston was extracted to prevent exposure. Naomi closed her laptop, exhaling slowly. The deeper she went, the worse this became. But there was no turning back now. Midnight was only a few hours away. And she had just put herself directly in the syndicate's crosshairs. Naomi barely had time to process what she had uncovered before her instincts screamed at her. Something wasn't right. The air inside the Charlotte Airport security office had suddenly shifted, the quiet hum of the monitors and radio chatter no longer background noise but a signal of impending danger. She had come here looking for answers, determined to track down Gregory Langston and connect the dots between him, Henry Wallace, and the Southern Syndicate. But the moment she stepped into the security office, the feeling of being watched settled over her like a heavy blanket. The officer at the desk, Rodriguez, had been helpful at first, concerned even, when she told him about the fake TSA agents who had taken Gregory. He had immediately pulled up surveillance footage from the terminal, but the video conveniently cut out just as Gregory was being led through the door. That was the first red flag. Then, just as she was about to make a call to the Atlanta field office, 3 men walked into the room. Naomi didn't need them to introduce themselves to know something was off. They wore dark suits, badges clipped to their belts, and carried themselves with the confidence of federal agents. But she knew real FBI agents when she saw them. These men moved with the kind of precision that came from military or private security backgrounds, not law enforcement. The tallest of them, a man in his early 40s with slick back hair and an unreadable expression, stepped forward. "Special Agent Carter," he said smoothly, flashing a badge so quickly that Naomi barely had time to register the details. "I'm Special Agent Brooks. We're with the Charlotte field office. We need you to come with us." Naomi stayed seated, her posture deceptively relaxed. "Funny," she said, tilting her head. "Because I didn't call for backup." The second man, stocky with a scar across his cheek, took a step closer, his hand resting near his hip. "This isn't a request." Rodriguez looked between them, suddenly nervous. He had been at this job long enough to know when something didn't add up. "Agent Carter is in the middle of an investigation," Rodriguez said carefully. "If you're taking over jurisdiction, I need to see proper credentials." The tension in the room thickened instantly. Naomi kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. If these men weren't real FBI agents, they were here for one reason: to eliminate her before she uncovered more. She glanced toward her phone, sitting inches from her fingers on the desk. She had to move fast. The man pretending to be Brooks took another step forward. "We don't have time for protocol." Naomi saw it before it happened, the slightest shift in the stocky man's stance, the tightening of his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward Rodriguez as if deciding whether to take him out, too. In a blur, Naomi lunged for her phone and dove to the side just as the first gunshot exploded through the air. Rodriguez barely had time to react before the fake agents opened fire. Naomi hit the ground hard, rolling behind a metal filing cabinet as bullets tore through the desk where she had been sitting seconds earlier. Rodriguez went for his own weapon, but he wasn't fast enough. One of the men fired, and the bullet caught him in the shoulder. He crashed backward, grunting in pain. Naomi gritted her teeth. She had seconds to act before they flanked her. She reached for her sidearm, yanking it free just as one of the men came around the cabinet. Before he could react, she fired 2 shots straight to the chest. The man crumpled instantly. Naomi didn't hesitate. She grabbed Rodriguez's arm and dragged him behind the cabinet, shielding him as another round of bullets shredded the air around them. "Stay down," she ordered, pressing her hand over his wound. He grimaced, nodding. "They're not FBI." "No kidding," Naomi muttered. She heard footsteps approaching fast. The remaining 2 gunmen were closing in. Think. There was no way out through the main door, it was too exposed. The office had one other exit, a secondary hallway leading to the airport's lower maintenance tunnels. Naomi took a breath, then did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She stood up. Before the second gunman could react, she kicked the desk forward, knocking him off balance. As he stumbled, she fired 1 clean shot to the knee. He collapsed with a pained scream. That left 1. The fake agent Brooks lunged at her, gun raised, but Naomi was faster. She twisted to the side as he fired, the bullet barely missing her before she slammed the butt of her weapon into his wrist, disarming him. He swung at her, but Naomi dodged, driving her elbow into his throat. He choked, staggering back, and in the next breath, she slammed him against the wall, pressing her gun to his ribs. His breathing was ragged, but he smirked. "You're already dead, Agent Carter." Naomi pressed the barrel harder against his side. "Who sent you?" He just grinned wider. Then, before she could react, he yanked something from his jacket, a small cyanide capsule. Naomi lunged, but it was too late. He bit down. His body seized, then slumped, his eyes going glassy. Naomi's pulse thundered. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. This was a cleanup job. The Southern Syndicate had sent professionals. She turned back to Rodriguez, who was pale but still conscious. "We have to go," she said. She helped him to his feet, his weight heavy against her, and they made their way toward the back exit. As they stepped into the dimly lit maintenance tunnel, Naomi took one last look at the scene behind her. 3 bodies. No answers. The only thing she knew for certain was that whoever was behind this wasn't done with her yet. The gunfire had stopped, but Naomi knew better than to assume it was over. The bodies of the fake FBI agents lay sprawled across the floor of the Charlotte Airport security office, but she and Rodriguez had no time to process what had just happened. More would be coming. Rodriguez was bleeding badly, his face pale from the gunshot wound to his shoulder. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. Naomi glanced toward the door leading to the maintenance tunnel. It was their only way out. She grabbed his arm and helped him up. "We need to move. Now." He gritted his teeth and nodded, his steps unsteady as she guided him through the back exit. The door led to a dimly lit corridor lined with electrical panels and utility pipes. It smelled of stale air and machine oil, but most importantly, it was empty. Naomi pulled out her phone as they hurried forward, dialing the only person she knew she could trust at this moment. "Omar, where are you?" "I'm with Henry," Omar's voice came through, hushed but urgent. "They've already moved him off the plane, but we're still in the terminal waiting for transport." Naomi's stomach clenched. "Listen to me carefully. Henry isn't safe. Neither are you. I need you to get him out of there, now." Omar didn't hesitate. "Where do we go?" Naomi scanned the tunnel ahead. They needed an exit that wouldn't put them back in the public eye. Then she saw it, a service stairwell leading to an underground parking level. "There's a short-term parking garage under the terminal," she told Omar. "Get there as fast as you can. I'll meet you." "Got it," he said. "Be careful." Naomi shoved the phone back in her pocket and tightened her grip on Rodriguez. "Hold on. We're almost there." They reached the stairwell just as Naomi heard distant footsteps behind them. Her pulse spiked. They weren't alone. She swung the stairwell door open and ushered Rodriguez inside. Heavy boots echoed from the corridor. They had seconds before they were spotted. "Go," she urged him, her voice low. "Get to the garage. I'll hold them off." Rodriguez hesitated, but he wasn't in any shape to argue. With a nod, he started down the stairs, gripping the railing to keep himself steady. Naomi pressed herself against the wall, her gun raised. The footsteps grew louder. Then, 2 figures burst through the doorway. More fake agents. The first one spotted Naomi and lifted his gun. She fired first. One shot to his leg, another to his chest. He went down hard, gasping. The second man lunged at her before she could aim, knocking the gun from her hand. The impact sent her crashing against the metal railing. He was bigger, stronger, but Naomi was faster. She dodged his next swing and drove her elbow into his ribs, then used his momentum to send him over the railing. He hit the landing below with a sickening crack. Naomi didn't wait to see if he got back up. She grabbed her gun and ran. By the time she reached the garage, Omar had Henry loaded into a wheelchair. The older man was conscious but weak, his face pale. Omar's eyes widened as he saw the blood on Naomi's sleeve. "Are you hit?" "Not mine," she said breathlessly. "Rodriguez is hurt. We need to get out of here before more show up." A black sedan was idling a few feet away. Omar gestured to it. "I borrowed it. Let's go." Naomi helped Rodriguez into the back seat while Omar got Henry settled beside him. Then she slid into the driver's seat. "Where to?" Omar asked as he climbed in. Naomi's hands tightened on the wheel. "We disappear." She hit the gas, tires screeching as they sped out of the garage. Behind them, the airport was still buzzing with passengers and security. No one knew what had just happened. But Naomi did. The syndicate wasn't just watching anymore. They were hunting. And now, she was running out of time. As Naomi sped away from the airport, her pulse was still pounding in her ears. The events of the last hour had unraveled into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Gregory Langston had been taken, Henry Wallace had nearly been killed, and she had barely escaped an ambush by fake FBI agents. But something still wasn't adding up. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Henry, who was slumped in the back seat next to Rodriguez. His breathing was still shallow, but he was awake now, his fingers weakly gripping the blanket Omar had draped over him. "Henry," she said, keeping her voice steady but firm. "I need to know who's behind this. Who tried to have you killed?" Henry exhaled a slow, shaky breath. "You already know," he murmured. "You just don't want to believe it." Naomi's grip on the wheel tightened. "Tell me anyway." Henry's eyes flickered open, and when he spoke again, his voice was hoarse but certain. "Margaret Collins." Naomi's stomach twisted. Margaret Collins. The same woman who had made a scene on the plane. The same woman who had refused to sit next to Omar. The same woman who had glared at Naomi with barely concealed disdain. The realization hit like a gut punch. Naomi had written her off as just another privileged, entitled woman who didn't like the world changing around her. But this wasn't about petty prejudice. This was about power. "She's more than just a wealthy executive, isn't she?" Naomi asked, her voice quieter now. Henry gave a weak nod. "She's not just part of the Southern Syndicate. She's one of the high-ranking members." He coughed, shifting in his seat, his voice barely above a whisper. "She manages their financial operations, makes sure the money moves clean, keeps the books looking legitimate." Naomi's mind raced. Margaret Collins, the woman who had thrown a fit over seating arrangements, was running the finances for one of the most dangerous crime networks in the country? It made sense, in a way. The syndicate thrived on connections, money, and influence. And Margaret Collins, with her pristine image, her high society friends, and her air of superiority, was the perfect cover. Naomi's jaw tightened. So, that's why she was on the flight. She was overseeing the shipment. Henry nodded slightly. "She doesn't get her hands dirty, but she makes sure the people who do are well taken care of." Omar, who had been listening from the passenger seat, let out a low breath. "That's why she didn't want to sit next to me," he muttered. "Not just because of my background. Because she was afraid I'd notice something." Naomi's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. Margaret had played it perfectly, posing as just another difficult passenger, blending into the background while keeping a watchful eye on everything. She had fooled them all. And now, Naomi knew the truth. The problem was, Margaret Collins knew that Naomi was still alive. And that meant she would be coming for her next. As Naomi drove through the dimly lit streets of Charlotte, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, searching for shadows that weren't supposed to be there. The airport had been too well planned. The fake FBI agents, the attack in the security office, it had all been a setup to eliminate her, Henry, and anyone else who knew too much. And now, Margaret Collins was in the picture, not just as a passing annoyance, but as one of the syndicate's key players. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. They weren't safe yet. Henry's voice, still weak but urgent, broke through the silence. "If Margaret knows we got away, she won't leave it to chance. She'll send someone to finish the job." Naomi didn't doubt it. The syndicate didn't take loose ends lightly, and right now, she, Henry, and Omar were the biggest loose ends in the entire operation. Omar turned to her, his expression serious. "So, what do we do?" Naomi exhaled sharply. "We stay ahead of them. We disappear." But even as she said the words, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The syndicate had resources, contacts, and corrupt officials in their pocket. If they put out a hit, it wouldn't just be a few hired guns chasing them. It would be a full-scale manhunt. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. A blocked number. Naomi hesitated, then answered. "Who is this?" A smooth, male voice responded. "Agent Carter." You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. A chill ran down her spine. You should have died back at the airport, the voice continued, almost conversationally. Now, you've made it personal. That's a shame. Naomi kept her voice steady. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing. The man chuckled. You're good, I'll give you that. But here's the problem, you don't have a way out. You think you can just disappear? You, Wallace, and the kid? He's scared. Not gonna happen. Naomi's pulse quickened. They knew about Omar, too. Here's what's going to happen, the voice went on. You're going to stop running. You're going to hand over Wallace. And maybe, I let you live. Naomi let out a cold laugh. Yeah? And what happens if I say no? There was a pause. Then, quietly, the man said, then I send people who don't miss. The call disconnected. Naomi stared at the phone for a second, then tossed it out the window. Omar shifted in his seat. That didn't sound promising. Henry coughed weakly. That was their warning. We won't get another one. Naomi's mind was already racing. The syndicate had called in a kill order. There would be no more subtlety, no more waiting. They would send professionals, men trained to eliminate threats efficiently and without a trace. She pressed harder on the gas, determination hardening in her chest. They think they can hunt us down, she said, glancing at Henry and Omar. Fine. Let's see what happens when the hunted start fighting back. Naomi's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she maneuvered the car through the dimly lit streets of Atlanta, her mind racing ahead to what came next. James Monroe, the name had come up in her investigation too many times for it to be a coincidence. He wasn't just another middleman for the Southern Syndicate, he was one of their cleanup men, the kind of person who made sure problems disappeared. And now, she had tracked him down. Monroe had landed in Atlanta an hour ago, likely unaware that Naomi was already on his trail. He was careful, but he wasn't expecting someone like her. Not tonight. She pulled into the airport parking garage, scanning the rows of vehicles for any sign of him. The space was quiet this late at night, the air thick with the lingering smell of car exhaust and concrete dust. She parked near the exit ramp, keeping the engine running in case she needed a fast getaway. Turning to Omar, she said, stay with Henry. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you leave. Omar's jaw tightened. Naomi. No arguments, she cut in. If I don't come back, that means something went wrong. You get Henry to safety. Understand? Omar swallowed, then nodded. Got it. Naomi checked her weapon, took a steady breath, and stepped out of the car. Monroe wasn't the type to meet in public unless he thought he had the upper hand. But she had studied his patterns. He liked to do business where he could control the variables. The airport parking garage was perfect for that. She moved between the rows of parked cars, her footsteps quiet, her senses sharp. Then she saw him. James Monroe leaned against a black SUV, the kind of high-end model preferred by criminals who wanted luxury with bulletproof windows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored suit with the jacket unbuttoned. His confidence oozed from every movement, the kind of arrogance that came from a man who had gotten away with too much for too long. He was on a phone call, but Naomi could hear his voice even at a distance. Yeah, she's here, Monroe said, his tone amused. Just like we thought. Naomi's pulse quickened. They had known she would come. She wasn't walking into a meeting. She was walking into a trap. She stepped forward, gun drawn, leveling it at Monroe. Hang up the phone. Monroe turned slowly, a smirk curling on his lips as he ended the call without hesitation. Agent Carter, he said smoothly. You're just as sharp as they say. Naomi didn't lower her weapon. You work for Margaret Collins. Monroe tilted his head. Work for her? No. But let's just say we share professional interests. She ignored his smugness. Where's Langston? Monroe chuckled. Straight to business. I respect that. He took a slow step toward her. But here's the thing, you're asking the wrong questions. Naomi's grip tightened. Then enlighten me. He exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. Langston was a pawn. You know that. His job was simple, move the product, keep the cash flowing, and don't ask questions. But then, he got nervous. Started getting sloppy. And in our business, sloppy gets people killed. Naomi kept her face unreadable, but inside, her mind was racing. So Langston hadn't been taken to be protected, he had been taken to be silenced. I'll ask again, she said, voice firm. Where is he? Monroe sighed. You really don't get it, do you? Before Naomi could react, a second figure stepped from behind a nearby column. She barely had time to move before she saw the flash of a silencer. She twisted just as the gun fired. The bullet grazed her shoulder, a sharp burn ripping through her as she dove behind a nearby sedan. Monroe's laugh echoed through the garage. Did you really think you were walking out of here alive? Naomi gritted her teeth, pressing her hand against the wound. The second shooter was moving fast, circling around the car. She didn't have time to hesitate. She fired 2 quick shots, the bullets slamming into the attacker's chest. He collapsed instantly, his weapon clattering against the pavement. Monroe's smirk faltered, just for a second. Naomi stood slowly, keeping her gun locked on him. Looks like you're out of backup. But Monroe wasn't rattled. He grinned. That's where you're wrong. The sound of footsteps. Naomi turned slightly, catching movement near the garage entrance. More men. Armed. Closing in fast. Monroe adjusted his jacket. See, unlike you, I don't work alone. Naomi's heart pounded. She had seconds to act. Then, a sudden roar of an engine. Naomi whipped her head toward the source just in time to see a silver sedan screeching into the garage at full speed. Omar. The car barreled toward Monroe's men, forcing them to scatter. Naomi seized the distraction. She fired at Monroe, hitting him in the leg. He crumpled against the SUV, cursing in pain. She didn't wait. She sprinted for the car as Omar threw the door open. Get in. Naomi dove inside just as gunfire exploded behind them. Omar didn't waste time. He slammed the accelerator, tires screeching as they tore out of the garage. As they sped toward the highway, Naomi pressed her hand against her bleeding shoulder, adrenaline keeping the pain at bay. Omar shot her a glance. Please tell me that was worth it. Naomi exhaled sharply. We got a name. Omar frowned. Monroe? No, Naomi said. The real person running this show. Omar's grip tightened on the wheel. Who? Naomi met his gaze. Margaret Collins. Omar swore under his breath. Naomi didn't take her eyes off the road ahead. The showdown wasn't over. It was just beginning. Naomi stood over James Monroe, her gun trained on him as he groaned in pain, clutching his bleeding leg. The dim overhead lights in the airport parking garage cast sharp shadows across the concrete, the scent of gasoline and rubber thick in the air. In the distance, the faint sounds of sirens echoed, but they were still far away. This moment was hers. Monroe tilted his head back against the side of his SUV, grinning despite the bullet lodged in his thigh. You got me, he said, his voice strained but smooth. Congratulations. Naomi didn't blink. I should kill you. Monroe chuckled, wincing as he shifted slightly. You won't. Her finger tightened on the trigger. You won't, he repeated, his voice laced with certainty. Because you still think this is about good and evil. About right and wrong. But I've been at this a lot longer than you, Agent Carter. And I can tell you, that's not how the world works. Naomi clenched her jaw, her heartbeat steady but strong. The world works just fine without people like you. Monroe exhaled, shaking his head. Naive. You think you're the hero in this story? The crusader cleaning up the corruption? Let me tell you something about corruption, sweetheart. It's the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Naomi didn't lower her weapon, but she let him talk. Monroe adjusted his position, his expression shifting from amusement to something almost reverent. You see, corruption, real corruption, isn't about greed. It's about balance, control, keeping things running smoothly. Do you really think the world works on justice? He scoffed. Justice is a fairy tale. What actually keeps people in power? What stops economies from collapsing? What keeps wars from spiraling out of control? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp despite his injury. Deals. Bribes. Compromises. Corruption isn't the disease, it's the oil that keeps the machine running. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had heard men like this before, people who justified their crimes by pretending they were necessary. Monroe continued, sensing an opportunity. You ever wonder why you never win, Agent Carter? Why the bad guys always seem to come back? Because we're not the problem. We're the foundation. Naomi took a slow breath, her grip firm. You sell people. You smuggle drugs. You launder money that fuels crime across the entire Southeast. And you call that balance? Monroe shrugged. You think hospitals don't need off-the-record supplies? That judges don't take favors to keep the system moving? You really think everyone in your own bureau is clean? He smirked. Even your precious Henry Wallace got too close and was shut down from the inside. Naomi felt anger burn through her veins, but she didn't react. That was what Monroe wanted, to make her question everything, to plant doubt. He sighed, as if disappointed. You can shoot me right now. But you know what'll happen? Someone will take my place. Margaret Collins will keep the operation running. And if she goes down, someone else will step up. You don't stop this, Naomi. You just shuffle the deck. She knew he believed every word he was saying. And that was the most dangerous thing about him, not his violence, not his money, but his conviction. You want my advice? Monroe asked, his voice low and even. Walk away. Take Wallace and that kid doctor and disappear. The syndicate isn't interested in you, they're interested in maintaining order. You force their hand, and they'll burn this city to the ground to get rid of you. Naomi let his words settle for a moment. Then she took a step closer, her gun pressing against his forehead. I don't believe in fairy tales, she said coldly. But I believe in something men like you don't understand. Consequences. Monroe's smile faltered. Naomi didn't shoot him. She pulled out her phone and pressed send on the message she had been drafting for the last 5 minutes, an encrypted file containing everything she had on the syndicate, Margaret Collins, and the corrupt officials protecting them. The recipient? A dozen federal agencies and media outlets. Monroe's eyes darkened as his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His smirk disappeared. Naomi gave him a small, satisfied smile. You just lost control, she whispered. Monroe's jaw clenched. You think this changes anything? I think, Naomi said, stepping back, you're about to find out. She turned and walked away, leaving Monroe bleeding and furious in the parking garage. This time, the deck wasn't just being shuffled. It was being burned to the ground. Naomi knew Monroe was stalling. His smooth voice, his calculated words, it was all a distraction. A way to buy time until reinforcements arrived. She wasn't going to give him that time. The air in the airport parking garage was thick with tension, the hum of distant traffic the only sound besides their breathing. Monroe was still slumped against his SUV, clutching his bleeding leg, but the arrogance in his eyes hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. You really think you win by exposing us? He scoffed. All you've done is put yourself at the top of our kill list." Naomi didn't respond. She heard it before she saw it, the unmistakable click of a weapon being cocked behind her. It was a trap. Instinct took over. Naomi dropped just as the first bullet whizzed past her head, slamming into the SUV behind Monroe. She hit the pavement hard and rolled, pulling her gun up and firing twice toward the direction of the shot. A figure, a syndicate operative, dressed in dark tactical gear, dropped instantly. But there were more. Too many. Shadows moved between the parked cars. 5, maybe 6 men. All syndicate. All heavily armed. Monroe, despite his injury, laughed. "You really thought you could walk away?" Naomi didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, weaving between cars as gunfire erupted around her. Bullets ricocheted off metal and concrete, shattering windshields, setting off alarms. Her mind worked fast. She needed cover. An exit. She spotted a low concrete barrier near the garage's exit ramp and dove behind it, pressing her back against the cold surface as gunfire continued. She checked her ammo. 5 shots left. Not enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, quickly scanning the message from Omar. "We're in position. Where are you?" Naomi's pulse spiked. They were here. Hope flickered, but she couldn't let herself get distracted. She needed to survive the next 2 minutes. She peeked over the barrier and fired 3 rapid shots. One hit a man's shoulder, sending him crashing against a car. Another took out a side mirror, making the shooter duck for cover. She had 2 bullets left. Monroe's voice rang out over the chaos. "This is pointless, Carter. You're surrounded. Just give up." Naomi exhaled. If she didn't move now, she wouldn't get another chance. Then she saw it, an opening. A stairwell leading down to the lower level, partially hidden behind a cement column. If she could reach it. She didn't let herself think twice. She sprinted. Bullets slammed into the pavement behind her, but she pushed forward, her legs burning as she dove for the door. She crashed through, stumbled down a few steps, and slammed into the railing. Gunfire followed, but the door was metal, it held. She took a deep breath, hard hammering. Then, a set of headlights flashed ahead. Naomi's instincts screamed at her to duck, but then, she recognized the car. Omar. The sedan screeched to a stop, the passenger door flying open. "Naomi. Move." She didn't hesitate. She ran to the car and threw herself inside just as Omar hit the gas. More bullets rained down from above, but the car peeled out of the garage, tires screeching. Naomi twisted in her seat, her chest heaving. Omar shot her a quick, worried glance. "Are you hit?" She checked herself. Her jacket was torn, her shoulder ached, but no blood. "Fine," she muttered. "Drive." Omar didn't argue. He pushed the car faster, weaving through the late-night Atlanta traffic. Naomi leaned her head back, her adrenaline still surging. She had barely made it out. But Monroe had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not yet. The car sped through the dimly lit streets of Atlanta, weaving through the late-night traffic as Naomi kept a sharp eye on the rearview mirror. The city lights flickered across her face, but her mind was locked onto one thought. They had the evidence, but now they had to get it out before the syndicate buried it forever. In the back seat, Henry Wallace clutched the flash drive in his trembling hand. His breathing was still labored from the poison that had nearly killed him, but his eyes were sharp with determination. His entire career, his very life, had led to this moment. He looked at Naomi. "We need a secure connection." Naomi nodded. "We're almost there." Omar, his hands tight on the wheel, shot her a glance. "Are you sure about this place?" "I trust them," she said. "They're waiting for us." Omar didn't argue. He took a sharp turn, pulling into the underground parking garage of an unmarked office building in downtown Atlanta. The entrance was nondescript, just another anonymous structure lost in the cityscape. Naomi hopped out first, scanning the perimeter. Then, she helped Henry out of the car, supporting his weight as they moved toward the elevator. When they reached the third floor, the door opened to a dimly lit room filled with monitors, cables, and the quiet hum of high-powered servers. A young woman in a hoodie and glasses glanced up from her workstation, her fingers still moving across the keyboard. "You're late," she said, not looking away from the screen. "Blame the shootout," Naomi said dryly. The woman, Evelyn Moore, an independent investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, arched an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she reached for the flash drive Henry handed her. "Everything's on here?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Names, transactions, wire transfers, smuggling routes. Every dirty deal the Southern Syndicate has made in the last decade." Evelyn let out a low whistle. "They're gonna want you dead for this." Henry exhaled slowly. "They already do." Evelyn inserted the drive into her laptop, and within seconds, encrypted files began to flood her screen. She adjusted her glasses as her fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up offshore accounts, money laundering schemes, and communication logs that directly tied high-ranking officials, including Margaret Collins and several federal agents, to organized crime. Naomi folded her arms. "How fast can you push this out?" Evelyn didn't look up. "I already started. The files are being uploaded to multiple platforms, secure databases, and trusted journalists across the country." Henry's breath hitched. Naomi put a steadying hand on his shoulder. "It's done, Henry," she said softly. "You did it." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For years, he had tried to fight this battle alone, only to be silenced, sidelined, and finally nearly killed. Now, at last, the truth was out. Evelyn's laptop beeped, and she smirked. "Too late for damage control," she murmured. "The world knows now." Naomi stepped toward the screen, watching as news outlets, social media feeds, and whistleblower sites began lighting up with the leaked documents. The Southern Syndicate had spent years hiding in the shadows. Now, the light had found them. As soon as Evelyn's files hit the public domain, the world erupted. News outlets scrambled to verify the leaks, but it didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. Names of powerful figures in government, law enforcement, and corporate America were laid bare. The Southern Syndicate had operated in the shadows for years, its reach extending far beyond what most had imagined. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. Within hours, federal agencies launched emergency investigations. The Department of Justice issued multiple arrest warrants. The FBI, under immense public pressure, was forced to act swiftly. Names that had once commanded respect were now attached to the words criminal conspiracy and corruption. But the syndicate wasn't going down quietly. James Monroe, bleeding from his gunshot wound and already on the run, was at the top of the most wanted list. The manhunt for him and other key figures in the syndicate began immediately. The FBI, U.S. Marshals, and even international agencies were mobilized. Margaret Collins, once the picture of high society and philanthropy, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Security footage showed her leaving her luxury penthouse in downtown Atlanta just before the leaks went public. Her car was later found abandoned near the airport, but there were no records of her boarding a flight. "She's running," Naomi muttered as she watched the news from Evelyn's safe house. "She won't get far," Henry replied, his voice tired but firm. "Not this time." Monroe, on the other hand, wasn't just running, he was fighting back. A heavily redacted FBI bulletin leaked onto the news, warning that certain law enforcement officers might be compromised. Monroe still had allies inside the system, people who owed him favors, people who would rather see him escape than risk him exposing their own crimes. "We need to move," Omar said. "If they're desperate, they'll do anything to silence us." Naomi agreed. They had exposed the truth, but now came the most dangerous part, surviving the fallout. Somewhere out there, Monroe and the last remnants of the syndicate were making their own plans. And Naomi knew that before this was over, they would come for her. The morning after the leaks went public, Naomi sat by the window of a safe house outside Atlanta, a lukewarm cup of coffee untouched in her hands. The sun had barely begun to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. It should have felt like a victory. The evidence had been released, arrests were happening, and the world was finally seeing the truth. But Naomi knew better than to celebrate too soon. She stared at the television screen, watching the breaking news scroll across the bottom. Monroe was still missing. Margaret Collins had vanished. And while several key figures of the Southern Syndicate had been arrested, there was an unsettling pattern emerging. Some arrests had gone smoothly, but others, too many, had turned violent. Several of the syndicate's top lieutenants had gone down fighting, choosing death over capture. Others had simply disappeared, slipping away before law enforcement could get to them. And those were just the ones Naomi knew about. "This isn't over," she murmured. Henry, seated across from her, sighed. He looked exhausted, his face still pale from his brush with death, but his eyes were clear. "It never really is," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze. "They're still out there. The syndicate is wounded, but it's not dead." Henry nodded. "You cut off one head, another grows in its place." Omar walked in, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what do we do now? Just wait for them to regroup and come after us?" Naomi set her cup down, determination settling deep in her chest. "No," she said. "We hunt them first." Omar exhaled, shaking his head. "I was afraid you'd say that." Naomi glanced back at the news, watching as the camera zoomed in on a fleet of black SUVs outside a federal building. More arrests. More charges. But she could still feel the weight of unfinished business pressing against her. She had learned the hard way, monsters like the syndicate didn't die easily. And as long as they were still out there, she wasn't done. In life, we often believe that justice is a straight path, that truth, once revealed, will always win. But the reality is more complex. Corruption, deception, and greed don't disappear overnight. Evil does not crumble simply because it is exposed. It fights back, adapts, and finds new ways to survive. But that does not mean we stop fighting. The greatest battles are not always fought with weapons or in courtrooms, but in the small, everyday choices we make. Standing up for what is right, even when it feels like no one is watching. Speaking the truth, even when others would rather keep things hidden. Protecting those who cannot protect themselves. For those who have lived long enough to see history repeat itself, the lesson remains the same. Change is never instant, and the fight for justice never truly ends. But that does not mean we give up. Instead, we do what we can, where we can, with what we have. Because in the end, it is not about winning or losing, it is about refusing to let darkness thrive in silence. It is about ensuring that the next generation inherits a world where integrity still matters.